Welcome to part 4 of our bird feeding series. We're going to talk a little bit about insect eating birds. So, there are a wide variety of birds that eat insects. But if you think about insects, there are times of the year in the north, especially, when there are lots of insects summer, spring. But then there are other times in the wintertime when there aren't many insects. So, a lot of birds who do eat insects, if they stay in the north, if they're resident birds that don't migrate, then they often will have to switch to other food sources. That doesn't mean there's no insects available in the wintertime, because a lot of insects also have life cycles and they're in maybe their egg stage or their larva stage or their pupa stage, and birds can find those sources and eat them. But nonetheless, a lot of them can't rely on insects exclusively during the wintertime, or they'd have a hard time surviving. Um, and then even birds that do eat insects a lot, like many of the insect-eating warblers, warblers being birds that, small little birds. We've talked about common yellowthroat. We've learned is one of them. They Many of them eat insects most of the time, but right before migration, they'll bulk up on fruit. Remember, we talked about fruit not being able to move, right? So if you need to build up a lot of energy quickly, one way to do that is to just grab everything in sight and eat it, which is often fruit. So when we talked about life cycles of birds and how they have kind of different times of their life cycle when they need a lot of energy. One is reproduction, when they've got to, you know, make eggs, lay eggs, and then feed young. And then the other big one for birds that migrate is migration. Migration takes a huge energy expenditure. And birds um, don't really store fat on their bodies. They really don't have places to store fat except right before migration. They actually have little pouches on their wings and their throat where they will store up fat reserves because it's such a hard process to go through migration. So some insect eaters will switch to fruit to do that right before migration. Right? So there are basically two categories of insect-eating birds that hawk birds on the wing, which means they chase after insects and eat them in the air. This is a high energy expenditure, right? You've got to chase down insects. Insects are quick, they're fast moving, they're agile, which means that you have to be quick and fast moving and agile, which takes energy. But the reward is pretty valuable. Insects are very high energy food. So there's kind of the birds that do this chasing after insects, there's sort of two adaptations of beaks, two categories. One are like these over here on the left that have the stubby bills with large gaping mouths. This little one in the corner is a bird called a nighthawk. Very strange looking bird, but look how big its mouth is when it opens up. Okay, so if you think about it, if you're chasing an insect, the bigger the opening that you can get that insect into, the better for you. And another set of birds that we have around here is the flycatchers. So flycatchers are a couple of bird families. Um, and one that we've already learned is the eastern phoebe. And you can't really tell from this picture, but their beak is much wider than, say, a sparrow or a warbler beak. And when they open their mouths, they can open their mouth up quite far, and it creates quite a large opening. They also have, you can't see it in this picture, but they have whiskers. They have, remember when we were looking at feathers, there are bristle feathers that are very much like whiskers, and they have a bunch of them around the edges of their beak to help them sort of filter those or direct the insects into their mouth. So those are one of the adaptation strategies. The other is to have a sharp, pointy beak, much like the great blue heron. They can open their beak up just a little bit and stab the insect and catch it that way. And there are a lot of examples of those. The bee eaters that we saw in the David Attenborough video would be a good example. There's another kind of bird that we don't necessarily think of it as insect eaters, but they are woodpeckers. Why are woodpeckers pecking on wood? They're pecking on wood not to destroy the wood, and they're not eating the wood. They're eating the insect's larvae and um, eggs or things they might find in the wood, usually in decaying wood, because the insects are in there living on the decaying wood. So if you have woodpeckers pecking on your house, you have some kind of problem other than woodpecker holes. You also have some kind of larval infestation, termite infestation. It could be ants, termites, whatever's in the wood. So let's think about birds that have to do this all day long. So they have to be adapted to not only drill a hole in the wood, so they have very powerful neck muscles. They have a pointed bill that can peck on the wood. There's a lot of bill adaptations that you might not realize, like their bottom mandible of their bill is slightly longer than their top mandible, which keeps their head from jarring. They kind of absorb that pressure into their jaw more than into their skull, because otherwise they'd have a headache all the time. They also have this really amazing tongue I want to talk about. So their tongue, if you think about where your tongue affixes to your body, it attaches at the back of your mouth, which means your tongue can stretch out a ways, but it can only stretch out, as long as your tongue is. It has that certain amount of flexibility. Well, bird tongues, woodpecker tongues, sorry, attach all the way. They go up and around their skull, and they actually attached here through their nostril. They attach up near their nostril in their skull. So their tongue is extremely long. So if you see this pileated woodpecker can probably stick its tongue out almost like 2.5, 3 inches. It's rather disturbing to see because you don't think a tongue should be able to go out that far. We don't really see it because they're sticking it into the wood, but this, again, there's no hands, right? You drill in a hole, you find an insect larva, you can't pick it out with your fingertips. You gotta grab it in some way, and so they have a tongue that can stick out, and then the end of their tongue, instead of being soft, it has a hard, horny sheath on it. And this hard shell in their tongue, and then it also has these barbs, that backward facing barbs. So just like a spear, it'll spear into and it grabs on with those backward facing barbs onto the insect, and they can pull it back into their mouth. So that's an actual adaptation for insect eating. One other thing I want to talk about with insects is that insect eating birds are very well adapted to being able to get insects in crevices, not actually burrowing into the woods. So a couple of birds that do that are nuthatches. This is a white-breasted nuthatch. We also have a red-breasted nuthatch around here. And this is a brown creeper. But a really interesting thing about these two birds, they share almost the same niche. If you remember studying ecology, there's a rule that says that no two species can share the same niche. They can't eat the same food, be in the same space, use the same resources. And these birds almost do that, but they divide up the resource but the way they collect. Okay, so they're both looking for insects, pupa, little seed bits, whatever they can find on tree bark. That's where they feed. But the nuthatches are adapted to work downward on the tree trunk. So they'll fly to the top of a tree trunk and they'll slowly make their way actually downward facing. With young children, we often call them the upside down clowns because most birds don't like to be upside down, but nuthatches are adapted for it. And they'll work their way down the tree trunk looking for, egg cases, pupa, whatever they can find in the tree. This little guy is a little bird called a brown creeper, a very small little bird that we do have here in Vermont. You see them in the forest. You can see you have to be good at looking for them though because they're very camouflaged. But they will fly to the base of a tree and slowly make a little spiral path up the tree, doing the same thing, looking in all the crevices. But they're able to kind of find different things because of the direction in which they're facing when they're working on the tree. So they can kind of split up the resources that way. Um, Other birds find the insects in other ways. A lot of warblers, these are very small pictures, sorry, but this little black-throated green warbler is able to kind of hover at the edge of the leaves, out on the edge or outer edges of the leaves, and pick insects off that way. This little guy, again, a very tiny picture, sorry about that, is a bird that actually uses a tool. So it actually uses a stick to dig down into places in the bark and dig out insects that are in there. So a lot of different techniques for getting at insects, but insects are a really good food source for birds, and so it's worth the adaptations and the specializations to get that food.